And thanks everybody for coming along. I don't know how many different parts of the world you've come from, but it's gorgeous in Edinburgh today. So I fully expected many people to be out in a socially distanced way, of course. So some of you, I apologise in advance, will know some of this already, in the sense that some of this material is reused from a talk I gave a little bit earlier this year at the Art of the Extended Mind event in Edinburgh at the Playfair Gallery. So apologies if anybody suddenly feels a little bit bored, but I am going to use the material in a rather different way today. So hopefully the big message here is going to be rather different. The picture you can see in front of the image in front of you now is one of the artworks from the Art of the Extended Mind exhibition that took place at the Talbot Rice Gallery earlier this year. And in some ways, what this talk is an attempt to get to grips with what I learned about thinking about cognition through being involved in the setting up and organisation of that exhibition, along with my colleagues Miranda Anderson, Mark Spivak, and Doug Cairns. So, and of course the people from the Talbot Rice Gallery. So here we go. In one sense, I'm going to pick up on this topic of what thinking is, what we should think about thinking, through the topic of creativity. So my primary target here is creative thought and what we should say about creativity from the perspective of cognitive science and philosophy of cognitive science. The bigger picture, as we'll see at the end, is that once we've done that, I think we can learn something about thinking in general. But when we get to that end of the talk, things become a lot more kind of amorphous, and there's some hand waving at the very end, as hopefully one should expect in any talk that tries to do something a bit new. Okay, so if we're fans of philosophy in the region of cognitive science and we're interested in the topic of creativity, it's pretty likely that the first book you'll reach for is Maggie Bowden's The Creative Mind, Myths and Mechanisms, still in many ways the classic text on creativity from a cog-sci perspective. Now, in that text, Bowden gives us a definition of creativity, or a characterization at least of creativity. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about this. It's the kind of definition of creativity that you'll see over and over again in the literature. And the definition that Bowden gives is that creativity is the ability to come up with ideas or artifacts that are new, surprising, and valuable. So we have these three qualities, three properties: newness, surprise, and value. So let me just say a little bit about what Bowden says about those things first of all. Basically, these three themes will pop up at various times during the talk, not always explicitly referring back to Bowden, but you'll see these themes hopefully reverberating through the talk. So Bowden, anyway, unpacks the notion of newness in terms of a distinction between, famously, a distinction between what you call psychological creativity, later individual creativity, and historical creativity. And the idea here is pretty straightforward. I might, for instance, come up with a song. Let's imagine I've never heard Bob Dylan before, but I work really, really hard on my guitar in my bedroom, and I come up with this song that actually is exactly Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, right? It's all the same chords, it's all the same tune, it's all the same words. Now, that would be an individually creative act for me, but no one will be particularly interested because it's been done before. So the idea is that psychological creativity on an individual level doesn't have to line up with historical creativity. Now, from certain perspectives, historical creativity is the more interesting of the two. But for our purposes, I think psychological creativity from a cognitive scientific perspective is the one that we'll probably want to be more aware of. Okay, so when we move to the notion of surprise, Bowden gives us three kinds of surprise. And what's important here is not the specifics of this, but I want just to draw out in a minute, I want to draw out the feel of this, the big picture approach to creativity that's going on here. So Bowden says that surprise can come in three forms: an unfamiliar combination of familiar ideas, an unexpected idea found within an existing conceptual frame, or conceptual space rather, and an apparently impossible idea resulting from a transformation of a conceptual space. So what we have here is this idea of conceptual spaces. These are like ways of thinking in the most sort of general and least technical sense. And you might think that practices in the art world, for instance, might be a kind of conceptual space, or a kind of art, say cubism or something. Impressionism is a conceptual space within which artists work. And you get these different levels or grades of surprise. When you just put together some familiar ideas in an unfamiliar way, you find some new idea, but within the general conceptual space of Impressionism or whatever, and then an apparently impossible idea. So something that from within that conceptual space is really very surprising indeed. But actually, when we do the analysis, turns out to be a sort of transformation in some of the principles or practices within that space. And finally, we get this idea of what we mean by value in the region here. And here I'm just going to point, I'm going to come back to this notion in a moment, just to make a point that when we talk about aesthetic value, we sometimes I think wrongly, and the creativity literature backs this up, think of aesthetic value as something that's sort of external to the creative act, as if it's something that we produce the product and then other people judge the value. But of course, valuing from an aesthetic value perspective is part of the very generation of the creative product. So generation and evaluation here are kind of intertwined phases in creation. We can split them up conceptually, but we can probably hardly ever split them up psychologically. And importantly here, when we think about evaluating a product during the production process, during the painting of the artwork or the writing of the song, or afterwards, this encompasses something we might want to call aesthetic value. Okay, good. So that's a kind of way of thinking about what creativity is. Again, as I say, within the region of the kind of work that goes on in philosophy of cognitive science. Now, more generally than the cognitive science here, but certainly still part of the picture, is the idea that creativity shouldn't be thought of as a separate psychological faculty, distinct from many other psychological faculties such as perception, reasoning, memory, and imagination. Rather, what many people think in philosophy and psychology around this topic is that creativity is somehow exhausted by some canny combination of these other psychological capacities. So we don't have a faculty of creativity, something like a romantic sort of faculty of insight or something. What we have is perception, reasoning, memory, imagination, and when these supposedly better understood psychological capacities are put together in a certain way, we churn out something that's creative. Now, there's a sort of project here of demystifying creativity, and this is the sort of first step of it. We don't think of creativity as something sort of that's separate, magical, or romantic way. It's really just more of the same old psychology, churning and whirring. And then, of course, we can fill in the picture. So usually in combination with that image, we pick our favorite psychological theory. So it could be classical computation, it could be connectionist pattern sensitivity, could be predictive processing, more on which soon. And what we do is we argue that all there is to creativity is just more of that clanking and whirring, right? More of that mechanical processing. So the idea is to demystify creativity through this sort of two-step process. And we can see some of this going on in Boden's analysis of surprise in terms of the exploration and transformation of conceptual spaces. So we might think that sort of search algorithms, for instance, might work their way through conceptual spaces in clever, heuristically guided ways to come up with new ideas within that space, unfamiliar ideas, or put together some existing ideas in a different way. So again, we can see how to apply standard practices in cognitive science to this apparently, high octane sort of top achievement of thought. And there's lots of versions of this kind of demystification process. Just to sort of give a slightly different twist on it that I'm going to come back to. This is for anybody, and most of you will know probably more than me about predictive processing, but for anybody in the region of predictive processing, this is a kind of very crude way of putting the point. But if you've got a theory of cognition which depends on the idea of minimizing surprise, minimizing error, and thus minimizing surprise, with all the special machinery of precision estimation, all that going on as well, then on the surface it looks to many people as if that's sort of problematic when it comes to predicting novelty, because you're trying to minimize error, and thus minimize surprise. Now, that's a completely crude sort of initial picture. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. But of course, what some people said immediately when faced with that kind of worry, why doesn't, and another version of it is, why doesn't the predictive processing agent, the prediction error minimizing agent, as we all famously know, go and sit in a dark room where there are going to be no surprises whatsoever and thus error is going to be minimized? Why doesn't that agent do that? Well, one way of there's lots of ways of approaching that problem, but one way is to think that surprise is something that actually is, in certain contexts at least, is predicted, right? So we enter some artistic context, we predict that there will be surprise, and thus it sort of fits with the model. So again, as a way of kind of demystifying what's going on by applying some standard computational framework, powerful computational framework to the topic. All right, good. Now, having said that, there's a kind of lingering worry that's in the background. And I want to bring this worry to the surface, or to the foreground. It's a pretty common observation in people who think about creativity from a cognitive scientific perspective, that if we go back to aesthetic values, that they're difficult to recognize or state, that aesthetic values are culturally variable, that they're contested, that they change over time. You can see this in the work of both Bowden and Elton, to whom I've already referred. And because of that, you sometimes get the claim, indeed Bowden and Elton both make it, that aesthetic values are hard to realise or render in some kind of algorithmic form because they've got these particular qualities. Similarly, we get this kind of quotation in the region of predictive processing. This is Schwartenbeck and colleagues. If our main objective is to minimise surprise over the states and outcomes we encounter, how can this explain complex human behaviour, such as novelty seeking, exploration, and furthermore, higher level aspirations such as art, music, poetry, or humour, our topics? Should we not, in accordance with the principle, prefer living in a highly predictable and unstimulating environment where we could minimise our long-term surprise? So you can see that worry being expressed. Now, again, not to say that nobody has ways of approaching this worry, but just for the moment, I want to make the point that prima facie anyway, you might think that this kind of surprise anyway, higher level aesthetic surprise, the higher level aspirations of art, music, poetry, or humour might be hard to render in basic predictive processing terms. Okay, now I'm going to pick now on a sophisticated version of this worry for predictive processing. And the idea here for the rest of the talk really is to state this worry, state the response to it from its author, which is Andy Clark, and sort of explore why that solution doesn't press all the buttons we need it to press, and to say something about how to press those buttons. So I don't see this as a kind of necessarily a critique of Andy here. I see it more as a development of something. But it's actually a development that's interesting because when Andy presents his solution, he draws a little bit on some of my previous work on creativity and for Cognition. So there's a kind of, somehow we're in a bit of a dialogue here and we need to work out what's going on. So Clark's worry here is what he calls the merely modest exploration trap for prediction error minimizing agents. And the thought here, there's a long build up to it in the paper, the Nice Surprise paper, but the thought here, the final thought, is that the guiding principle that governs prediction error minimizing agents, which is basically head for a state in which there's zero prediction error, remains unacceptably conservative, that's Andy's term, when measured against the goals of human growth and flourishing through, for example, creativity in art. And in making it clear what this means, to think of it as, think of this guiding principle as somehow unacceptably conservative, what Clark does is put it in very general terms. And what's interesting here is this goes beyond worries about prediction processing and creative surprise, and indeed puts us in contact with, as Andy puts it, any purely information theoretically specifiable goal. So what he says is that any purely information theoretically specifiable goal, which we might think governs the behaviour of some agent from this demystifying perspective, will be hostage to some scenario in which the agent is provided with an endless, intuitively boring or trivial supply of whatever quantity is in the frame. And he gives us an example. So he says, imagine that our information theoretically specifiable goal is to maximize predictive success. And this says this will undoubtedly allow this agent to reach for new states and new patterns in its world. But the thought is that merely maximizing that kind of predictive success is subvertible by really boring scenarios, which will mean that this agent could get trapped in a kind of minima, which we would think of as not meeting the criterion of human growth and flourishing. So the example he gives is an agent that could satisfy this this property of maximizing predictive success by rearranging a finite but actually lifetime-wise inexhaustible supply of small coloured tiles. Okay, lots of predictive possibilities here. What will I see if I look over here? What will I do? What will I see if I arrange things this way? But as Andy nicely puts it, this looks like just a more psychedelic version of the darkened room worry, right? This is not going to match what we think is at the core of human flourishing. All right, so there's this worry that any information theoretically specifiable goal, including getting to zero prediction error, will be subvertible by this kind of scenario, and thus doesn't do enough to satisfy our understanding of what human flourishing in the region of art and creativity involves. All right, now, as you'd expect, I'm just going to take a quick sidestep and then back into the main thrust of things through sort of embedded cognition, because that's going to help us here. So there's a general kind of perspective out there. I'm not going to worry today about fine-grained differences between embodied, embedded, extended, whatever cognition. It's just all one big package for today. So in non-trivial ways, here's the package. In non-trivial ways, someone who supports this view will say thoughts, experience, intelligent behavior routinely result from, or more radically are routinely constituted by, entangled systems of neural, bodily, technological and cultural elements. Right, so we all recognize, I think, this kind of picture now. And if we turn our attention towards artworks, we can think about artworks themselves as the product of entangled psychological systems, which is a picture that I've explored in a paper of mine talking about more than heads. And the idea is that when creativity happens, it happens, psychological creativity happens through entangled systems of brain, body, technology and culture. And what we get at the end of it, the creative product, is not a kind of core dump from some inner kind of fully worked out artwork that's already in the head of the agent, but comes through these complex systems of entangled causal spreading out through brain, body and world. We all know this picture, I think, so I'm just going to just leave that quickly today for time. But the bit I want to focus on in this, because this is important for what's coming up. So here's what I'm going to call for today creative cognitive niche construction. And this is the process by which artists, musicians or whatever, build external structures, creative products, that in combination with pre-existing, process in which artists build external structures to produce creative products. That's going to be the end result here. So the process by which artists build external structures that, in combination with pre-existing practices that you pick up from your artistic practice, what you learn as an artist, transform psychological spaces in ways that aid creative thought. And this is just a local adaptation to creativity of this idea of cognitive niche construction that Andy Clark talked about in Supersizing the Mind, that Andy and I talked about together in the Culture, Embodiment and Genes paper. And the basic idea is this idea that we design environments in order to think better. And in the vicinity of creativity is the fact that we design external structures, sometimes whole environments, in which we then can produce creative products. There's lots of examples of this. For time, I think I'll just do these really quickly. Some of these examples will be familiar to you. This is the early modern theatre. It's the Globe. Reference Lynn Tribble's work, fantastic work on this from a distributed cognition perspective, where she shows how your early modern theatre company was producing vast numbers of new plays, sometimes putting on as many as 6 plays a week, often new plays, little group rehearsal, little time for learning and so on. And the idea would be that if we approach this from a certain perspective, we'd have to say that these individual actors had kind of superhuman memory capacities. But in fact, what we see is a distributed system where the environment of the designed environment of the early modern theatre supports the cognitive activity of the actors so that they can deliver their creative performance. And in particular, in this case, it does so by the fact that actors actually ended up learning really stripped down versions of the parts. They learnt their own part, but in terms of anybody else's part, they only learnt kind of cues at the end and beginning of the parts. And they worked with, you know, pretty meager resources, certainly not the whole play. And then backstage, there would be a thing called a plot pinned up, which was basically a kind of summary of main entrances and exits, music cues, and so on. So in real time, in effect, the actors would structure the play using this distributed system. Another nice example that I've used in other places of this kind of niche construction in the area of creativity is the fact that when Wagner was kind of half thinking of a new bombastic kind of music, he had to actually build a theatre in order to have the music come out, right, with a bigger orchestra pit that allowed for bigger instruments and so on. And that was the construction of the theatre where Parsifal was first performed, and in fact where Wagner didn't want the opera to be performed anywhere else, and it was a long time after his death that it was. So there's this idea that to get the creative product right, sometimes we build these environments, we design environments to create in. Now let's go back to Clarke's trap, right, at this point. Clarke's trap, of course we can use predictive processing ideas to think about how a musician, for instance, has learned to reduce prediction error with respect to complex melodies and motor repertoires. But as Clarke argues, the practices of music, art, literature, and so on, these aspects of designer environments, reliably and repeatedly move the goalposts for our prediction error minimizing machinery. And that's what nudges the artist away from local equilibria and ensures, as Clarke puts it, change, innovation, and challenge. So the idea is we have these predictive processing mechanisms that have this, unacceptably conservative, overarching information theoretic principle of minimizing prediction error, but dump those kind of systems in these kind of environments, and we can see where the novelty comes from. That's the idea. All right. Now, what's important here for our purposes is that Clarke notes himself in a quote I'll give in a moment that the ultimate source of the genuine novelty in creation is not the prediction error minimizing machinery, but the scaffolding. It's the environments, the practices in which the predictive processing machinery works. So as Clarke puts it, there's a hedge here, which I'm just going to ignore, but I thought I'll highlight it because it is a hedge. An implication may be that true conceptual novelty, when it arises, is better explained as, at least in large part, a result of the framing and scaffolding of human activity by shifting cultural practices and changing sets of concrete constraints. So the idea is we minimize prediction error in one sort of area, but then the environment moves, right? So now we have a new goal, and that's what continually forces the kind of innovation that we see in art and creativity. That's the picture. Now, as far as I can see, if we assume that the only true psychological processes here are the prediction error minimization ones, it's not obvious at all to me that this solution solves the problem rather than simply relocates it. So I've called this moving the goalposts in a bad way. Because the guiding principle governing the agents here is still head for a state in which there's zero prediction error or maximize predictive success, or however one characterizes that information theoretically. So the goal that the agent follows is still unacceptably conservative when measured against the goals of human growth and flourishing through creativity and art. And that sort of follows because the goal hasn't changed. The goal of the psychological mechanisms hasn't changed here. What's changed is the environment in which those systems work. So the shape of Clarke's solution is that the engine room of creative innovation can't be prediction error minimization or any other information theoretic goal. It has to be found in the external context and practices. But then why should that prediction error minimizing machinery, that's the psychology here, with its overly conservative goal, generate artistic contexts and practices that nudge us in the way required? Again, because of the overarching conservatism of the goal, it doesn't seem there should be any force here to create the kind of context in which innovation and surprise of the right kind happens. All right, now I'm sure lots of you are thinking, well, but I can see way around this. But what I'm going to give you is a diagnosis. I don't think this is the end of the story, right? I'm not going to pack up and go home just with that really quick comment. What's interesting is what happens once we explore this thought, right? That's raised here. Now, I think the diagnosis here is that why this seems unacceptable as a solution, at least to me, is intertwined with the standard view of cognitive niche construction, which is a way of understanding the building of designer environments as being geared towards problem solving, and somehow normally adaptive problem solving, some sort of story of that kind. The adaptive bit isn't the issue today, merely the context that we think of cognition, and thus we think of cognitive niche construction, which is a special kind of cognition, as being geared towards problem solving. That's what cognition is. It's problem solving. And that's really a very deep assumption in most cognitive psychology, for instance. And I'm going to suggest 3 possible departures from this model that in combination might solve the problem that Clark raises, and which I think he doesn't solve. But they also reshape the theoretical landscape in a fundamental way. So the 3 departures, which I'm going to do in, I think I've got between, I think 35 is my outside, and I'm going to come within that. So constraints and contingency as opening up spaces for innovation while themselves being productive creative forces. Remember, designer environments has this whole idea of designing the environment to produce some sort of outcome. Right, that's what Wagner did when he had the theatre built, right? But I'm going to suggest that a lot of the ways in which information theoretic systems engage with external constraints and contingency are actually have a different kind of character that doesn't fit that designer environment model. It doesn't necessarily mean we need to get rid of the designer environment idea altogether, as we'll see, but we'll reconceive it. And then there's this issue of designer environments minus problem solving. What would happen if we dropped the idea that cognitive niche construction was about problem solving? And finally, I'll say something about experimentation and what I'm going to call a creativity first approach. All right, quickly then through these 3 things. I'm going to start with a quote, which is kind of cheekily what Andy says when he refers to my own work, because this actually brings it out. So here's what he says. For example, Wheeler shows using multiple real world cases, this is the talking about more than heads paper, how external developments such as new equipment and room acoustics can create physical spaces and opportunities that constrain individual exploration in ways that yield new forms of music and musical performance. This also speaks to the observation that cultural scaffolding often seems to constrain novelty rather than enable it. Both effects routinely occur, with conceptual novelty often resulting from changes to what might superficially seem like quite tangential factors, but ones that turn out to have deep impacts upon each individual and collective innovation. So in a way, what I'm going to do is pick up on this reference that Clark makes to my work, and then really run with it, right, and see what work it can do in trying to solve the problem that Clark nicely outlines. So some of you will have heard these examples before. These are my favorite examples of how constraints contingency play into creation. This is the room at CBGBs when it used to be in New York. I say that with a deep sense of loss. And the great thing about CBGBs as an environment, which is where bands such as Talking Heads and Television came through in the late 70s, the great thing about CBGBs as an environment is it had extraordinarily low levels of reverberation, and there was an enormous amount of noise in this environment from the bar. Right. So what you had is a really interesting acoustic environment where the reverberation was so low that the music could explore quite intricate factors, which is why, in some ways, as David Byrne points out in his own reflections on this, the music of the Talking Heads and Television was way more intricate than the music of a lot of other punk and new wave bands. That's one reason. Because the intricate guitar playing could be heard in the environment of CBGBs, but it still had to be loud because otherwise you'd be swamped by the crowd at the bar. And that's why Talking Heads sound like they do, right? And that's David Byrne talking, right? Here's another example. When vinyl records came out, you could only get about 4 minutes of music on each side. How did that, impact on creativity? Well, a lot of pop music came in at just under 4 minutes, so you could fit a song on either side. But actually, in some sense, classical composers started including decrescendos after nearly 4 minutes and crescendos just after 4 minutes, so that their music could be nicely split over the 2 sides of the single. So the form of the music changed through a contingent constraint. And final example, which I love, is as Scott Joplin points out, and the reason you have improvisation in ragtime and jazz music is because the bands were playing in social environments where people could dance for a lot longer than the songs lasted. Right? You wouldn't have improvisation if it wasn't for that. Right? That's Scott Joplin talking. So these examples are supposed to be examples of the following sort sorts of things, right? These are designed environments, and they are spaces in which creation happens, but they're not designed for the creative act in question. If we say the creative act is producing music of a talking heads kind, right? Or if we think it's to produce jazz music of a certain form, or it's to produce music that fits a certain kind of temporal structure, right? These environments, these constraints are there for other reasons. It's the shape of CBGBs. It's the limits of vinyl technology. It's the fact the social environment of the ragtime dens was the way it was. Nevertheless, these factors stamp themselves on the form of the product. So these sort of chance and contingent constraints are themselves productive creative forces. And what we see here is something quite interesting, I think. Often when we do cognitive niche construction, we often talk about ratcheting or bootstrapping, where one environment builds to another environment, which creates a higher level of cognitive performance. Then that environment supports another platform for even higher levels of cognitive performance. But these are not bootstrapping, right? The effects here are sort of sideways rather than directed. And that comes from their sort of, in a sense, undesigned nature, at least not designed to produce the very specific product that we see at the end of it. So that's the first way in which, and you can see how these sorts of constraints, which are not part of the designer environment story, which is the story that Clark wants to tell in that excellent paper, a nice prize paper, how they have these very specific features, right, that plausibly do some of the nudging in question. What have we got? Right, okay, yeah, okay, last few things. Okay, so do these really, really quickly. Sorry for the time. But, okay, so ignoring the general issue of whether we should think about cognition as problem solving at all, I at least want to make the claim, right, that seeing artistic creativity via designer environments as problem solving is not mandated, right, necessarily. And there's work on this that I'm just going to point to for today, Karen Kukinen's work, some work by Miranda Anderson, where these people are arguing that, these thinkers are arguing that designer environments, as they turn out in kind of art and creativity, aren't really best thought of as problem solving, except unless you give a really kind of trivial reading of what problem solving is. I mean, it's always possible to come up with some problem solving description, right? Well, the problem is it's a space to perform some stuff, right? And it solves that problem, right? But if we think about the very specific features of the creative product, and particularly the kind of newness and surprise, the idea that the environments are sort of designed to do that isn't always mandated. I'm not saying it's never mandated, but it isn't always mandated. So at least there's a broader canvas here. So we're sort of shifting, we're moving to chance and contingency as key factors in the creative process. And we're not thinking about creation on the problem solving model, which of course is the model that's in the background behind algorithmic computation, in, connectionist pattern completion, and indeed predictive processing, that deep understanding of cognition as problem solving. I'll just say something really quickly about this. Those at my talk at the art event will have heard this before. I often one thing I want to do is move finally to this creativity first sort of model and sort of reverse the order of traffic. And I can't say very much about this apart from this example and a bit of hand waving. So that's how I'm going to finish. At the moment, the model for understanding creativity is that we understand perception, memory, and so on through some information theoretic story or information processing story. And then we try and, as it were, absorb creativity. But what would happen if we started by thinking about creativity as a kind of basic phenomenon and allowed that to seep into our understanding of what perception and memory and so on is? So here's just a way of kind of getting into the right area. A beautiful work, well, this is with Kuhn writing on Bacon rather than Bacon himself. There's a dispute about that in the history of science, don't worry about that. But Bacon apparently claimed that scientific experiments twist the lion's tail. What did Bacon mean by that? He said, in scientific experiments, we interfere in nature so as to produce nature under constraint and vexed, when by art and the hand of man, she is forced out of her natural state and squeezed and moulded. And that's how Bacon thought about scientific experiments. And Ian Hacking, in some of his really interesting work on this, runs with this idea and says that his philosophical and historical accounts of experiment in science, in his philosophy and history of science, distort the character of experimentation because of a sort of an obsession with theory, of seeing experiments as playing out theory. When what they really do, or testing theory, when what they really do, according to Hacking, is involve practical knowledge of how to manipulate entities, practical skills such as debugging equipment and so on, aimed actually at generating phenomena that we then wish to investigate and understand. And Hacking gives lots of examples from the history of science that fit this model. So I want to get to this idea that actually some of what we do in creative thought is this twisting the lion's tail. It's creating phenomena that we wish to investigate and understand. And the artworks themselves are a way of performing distinctive tail twisting experiments with entangled psychological systems, for making our psychological systems go into these different parts of space, creating, if you like, phenomena for us to then think about. There's a kind of element of what I like to call creativity first in this, that scientific research, at least of experimentation kind, understood with an open mind, is a kind of embodied creative act. And that this could be our model for all embodied thought. Just like Alvanoe, for instance, thinks that touch ought to be the model for perception, and then we'll get a much different understanding of what perception is, touch rather than vision. So touch becomes active and exploratory, whereas vision is traditionally thought of as passive, picture in the head stuff. And Noe thinks that all perception ought to be thought of on the active model. I want a similar kind of transition here. Last slide. So what would a creativity, this is where the hand waving starts, right? Because apart from giving this kind of example, I don't have a big story about this. So I want to create a space in which we might think about this. So what would a creativity first approach to thinking look like? What would other psychological capacities, such as perception and reasoning, look like if we saw them through the lens of creativity? That somehow they are kind of intrinsically creative. And I think there is some hints of this in recent memory research, where we think about remembering as a kind of creative filling in of lots of details that don't necessarily, you know, as it were, match up with the original event. The memory isn't about accurately recalling the past. It's about fastening onto some odd things that you got the kind of gist of what happened, and then just filling in creatively lots of detail. What if that might be a model for more of what cognition is like? What would things look like if what we learn by studying aesthetic creativity with an open mind, i.e. not from a kind of perspective where we're trying to drag it in with all these other phenomena, informed our account of perception as much as the other way around? So that's the kind of picture I'm looking for. And I just want to point here that some enactivist research, recent enactivist research, might point in this direction, though I think without much detail. And I mean, just recently, I just want to mention the work of someone who's just coming through the ranks, Miguel Sepulveda Pedro, who really is, I think, doing some interesting work thinking about what perception would be like as a kind of creative process, drawing on Merleau-Ponty and some of the enactivists. So that's just a note for someone to look out for, I think. So I kind of want to open up this third sort of movement away from the sort of problem-solving model, is to try and sort of see creativity as at the center of things rather than just a kind of peripheral thing that we get to once we've nailed all the other mainstream psychological capacities. And that, I think, brings us back to the artwork. Thank you very much.